All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this, our 21st speakers event of Michaelmas term. I believe we're also going to be going out at some point via Facebook Live and obviously via the YouTube channel, so if anyone is watching there, hello to them. Tonight, we are enormously excited to be able to welcome one of Britain's most influential journalists to the Union. Robert Peston is the current political editor of ITV News and host of the weekly discussion show Peston on Sunday. He was the business editor of BBC News during the financial crisis, so from 2006 to 2014, and in that capacity, he became a regular presence on screens across the country. He's also published several books, including the book we're going to be starting off the discussions talking about, WTF, released just a matter of weeks ago. So, without further ado, give a massive round of applause to Robert Peston.
That sounds really kind. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Fabulous. So I was just talking to Rob, and he said he was at Oxford a couple of weeks ago. So there's the bar we have to reach today. Or
You'll be way over it, don't worry about it.
Thank you. So I told one of my friends today that I would be interviewing Rob Peston on his new book. He asked what it was called, and he said, WTF, and he replied saying, well, that's what a lot of us have been thinking over the past few years. So what was it what made you write this book? And I suppose, can you talk to us a little bit about the title?
Yeah, so it's, what is the time? So it's only 5. So it's obviously stands for Where's the Furniture? So the reason I wrote the book was because I suppose the simplest way of explaining it was I was shocked in a way at how disconnected I'd become from a country that I thought I understood, and a country that made me what I am and that I love. And why do I say that? It's because when the Brexit vote happened, one of the things that I noticed was that among my friends and family, I couldn't identify a single one who had voted for Brexit. And that was profoundly shocking, because here was a country making, in my view, the most important decision about its political and economic future that certainly anyone alive had been asked to make. And I turned out to have been on not only the losing side of the argument, but so had everybody else that I knew. And this was deeply troubling, because I don't think of myself, I never thought of myself as being part of some sort of privileged elite. I went to a comprehensive school. All my journalism has been about trying to understand the way the world works, and because I spent quite a lot of my working life in this country, the way Britain works. And to have got it so wrong was just profoundly shocking and, I have to say, upsetting. And so that was the sort of germ for why I wanted to write the book. Now, that having happened, I did then think that Trump was probably going to win in America, as he duly did, but that was still, not what somebody who had been brought up to regard voters as rational would have expected. It was again, although, as I say, I sort of slightly feared and actually did predict that it would happen, it was still profoundly troubling. And so the book is all about making sense of why we have seen this very big people's revolt, why our societies have become so divided, because, of course, Brexit wasn't won by a landslide. Trump, in fact, got fewer votes. He just got them in the right places. But broadly, what you see in America and Britain is deeply divided nations. In fact, you can now see them all over the rich West. The failure of Angela Merkel to be able to form a government at the moment is, in a sense, another manifestation of these sort of rather sharp divisions. So the book is about trying to understand where these divisions come from, why so many millions of people, particularly on lower incomes, are so angry, and then how do we try and fix this? How do we try and run things? I mean, and just to be absolutely clear, those people who voted for, I do say in the book, those people who voted for Brexit, and what I mean by this, I mean those on the sort of lower incomes who voted for Brexit, were on the right side of history. Their interests had been ignored for far too long. Their incomes had been stagnating. They'd lost hope both for themselves and for their children. And this was their one opportunity to kick the establishment, to kick the Blairs, to kick the Camerons and say, look, enough is enough. You have been, whatever your rhetoric, you have not been governing for everybody. You've been governing essentially for a privileged elite. And that has to change. So, as I say, the book was about exploring why so many people were left behind and what we do about it.
Yeah, I just want to unpack a little bit more that sense of cultural divide and those two cultures. So, especially in a university context, like the one we're inhabiting here.
Yeah.
I mean, the council ward which the union is in was, I believe, the highest voting Remain ward in the whole of the UK. I think it was 88.2% voted Remain. So, do you think this cultural divide, how entrenched do you think it is? And how can we sort of begin to understand, I suppose, the other side? And do you think that coming to understand the other side is important?
That's absolutely vital. I mean, and let's be clear, these divisions are a patchwork. They are multiple. So you've got, I'll talk about the divisions and then I'll try and relate them back to some of these votes. So you've got an older generation, that's my generation, who own all the assets, right? We own the houses, we have job security, we have pensions. Most people in this room have none of that. And what's more, right now, very difficult to see what any government is proposing, any actual, very difficult to see what the actual government is doing to give any of you hope that much of that is going to change, right? So old versus young. We've got metropolis versus towns and country. Much faster growth in cities on the whole, much less fear of change, of immigration in cities, in urban areas versus towns and country. Then in a country like the UK and indeed US and indeed in most developed countries, there are huge regional disparities. So in this country, you've got a northeast where incomes are on average about 50% lower than in London and the southeast, where productivity, the underpinning of sustainable earnings, productivity in the northeast, more than a third lower than in London and the southeast. So you have this great sort of multiplicity of inequalities. City versus town, old versus young, north versus south. And when you put all that together, it creates, first of all, a very fragmented nation, and secondly, a huge challenge in persuading people that the way things are being run in a sort of one nation kind of way. So it is complicated, and you can see exactly the same complicated pattern of divisions. In other, as I say, of the mature, rich economies.
Yeah. And I suppose we can ask, when did you first sort of begin to spot these divides beginning to pull themselves together? So what was the role, I suppose, of the financial crisis in that? Do you think that was the moment which has caused long-lasting divides to crystallize and enter into a sort of
Well,
richer
so
state?
many of these trends massively predate the financial crisis. Okay, so regional inequalities, generational inequalities have been much longer in the gestation. The stagnation of those on lower incomes has been much longer in the making, partly because of the hollowing out of manufacturing and the more recent hollowing out of middle-skilled jobs as a result of robotics. So, these are longer-term economic trends. Now, the impact of the financial crisis was to bring things to a head because we had that incredibly sharp recession, the worst recession since before the war, which meant that the stagnating and the lower growth was on top of a collapse in everybody's income. And it just, and the thing which is in a way extraordinary is that it's taken almost a decade since that crash, which impoverished, pretty much everybody, but particularly poorer people most. It's extraordinary that it's taken almost a decade for this revolt to take place. Now, one of the reasons why I suspect the revolt is now happening is because there's a phrase which says never waste a good crisis. Well, the crisis was wasted. The moment to really try to think about how globalization was failing people, because a lot of this is, frankly, can be characterized as the failure of globalization. That was the moment, the crash, when the fundamental flaws in our economic system should have been addressed, and they weren't. Worse than that, the actual medicine that was applied, in fact, it was more of an anesthetic than a medicine, as it were, actually highlighted how unfair the way that we run the economic system is, because, as I'm sure most of you are aware, governments themselves more or less abdicated responsibility for trying to fix the system because they said, well, we haven't got the money, because after the crash, because of the recession, tax revenues collapse, and you get these ballooning deficits, this increase in annual borrowing, which adds to the national debt, and governments adopted a very conventional approach, which was one of austerity, and they basically said it's over to you central banks to sort this out. So central banks did their duty. They cut interest rates to next to zero. They created an unprecedented amount of new money, and they did that with a deliberate aim of increasing the price of assets, properties, shares, to restore confidence so that consumers and businesses would start spending again. It worked to an extent. We haven't had particularly robust growth since then. It's been a bit anemic, but nonetheless, you did eventually, after a couple of years' lag, get a resumption of some growth. But of course, in the cure, you exacerbate the reality of how unfair the system is. Because, who owns the assets? Who owns the houses? Who owns the shares? It happens to be, older, richer people. And so in the cure itself, when it comes to wealth, if not incomes, you are widening inequalities. And so I think part of one of the reasons why people have now said enough is enough is because, as I say, even in the cure, inequalities got worse.
Do you think these trends which you've been tracing, can they be reversed? So we've looked at, I suppose, since the 1980s, this pathway of globalization, which has been continuing. And I suppose if you look at in particular Britain and America's place in the world, it is being transformed by the growth of other economies. Do you think that we can actually step in to combat these inequalities, and if so, how?
Well, not without really fundamental reforms. So the consensus in the sort of 1980s was governments can't pick winners, and therefore governments can't directly intervene in places like the Northeast to create, viable businesses. And what governments hoped was if you essentially nurture centres of excellence, they will expand enough, generate enough revenue, such that, you can then pay for your welfare state, and you sort of hope over time, if you slightly fix your schools, that people in these depressed areas acquire sort of relevant skills that might mean that they, get employed in sort of reasonably fulfilling ways. It didn't really work out that way. What actually happened was, well, what was the one really world-class industry that we had? Well, it was in the City of London. But unfortunately, because of the way that this particular world-class industry was deified, nobody kept an eye on the sort of mad risks that were being taken there. And so ultimately, this great monster in the city actually, as you all know, ended up doing us really quite a lot of damage. And in the meantime, huge swathes of the UK just, didn't develop enough genuinely productive indigenous businesses to provide hope to the people who lived there that their lives were going to get significantly better. And, arguably we could have sort of set ourselves up a bit like the way that China is set up, and we could have said, right, we will have absolutely, because one of the things that is clear in the modern world is that cities are a very efficient way of living. They tend to, and the great thing about cities is they act as a magnet for productive businesses, and the businesses then talk to each other, and they then improve their own productivity through that sort of mutual conversation. So you could have theoretically said, right, we will write off 2/3 of the UK by land mass as basically areas which are never going to have productive businesses, and we're going to abolish all planning constraints on London and the southeast, and London can become effectively Europe's Shanghai, and it'll move from a population of roughly 10 to roughly 35 million. And that would have been a sort of plausible, if in my view utterly insane, economic policy, but economically it would have made sense. Right, because if you look at the way that globalization works, that would have undoubtedly, and London would now be connected to Cambridge, by the way, and the very successful tech companies here, there'd be very little green between here and London, but that would have been a coherent economic model. Well, actually British people don't want that. They're never going to vote for that. But the alternative to that is to be more interventionist in parts of the country that aren't doing well, to throw much more money at schools, but also think in a much more imaginative way about the curricula of schools. Two or three of the things that I talk about in the book. So one of the things I say that is, there's been an utter failure of imagination when it comes to monetary policy, for example. I mean, I do think that, if you're putting so much responsibility on the cost of money in terms of economic growth, then you've also got to think about the fact that in a place like the Northeast, the cost of money and the availability of money should obviously be greater. So there should be more cheap money available in the Northeast than there is in London, plainly. And there are ideas in the book for how you make sure that the cost of money is more appropriately matched to regional conditions. equally, I do think that one of the things that's gone wrong is that's just talking about the regional inequality. The other thing that's gone wrong, as you probably are all aware, is that Labour's share of income in countries like ours, one of the reasons incomes have been stagnating is because a disproportionate amount of the income that economies like ours produce goes to capital, it goes to owners. And that's partly a function of the crushing of trade unions. Now, there was some logic to making the economy more flexible, particularly in those early phases of globalization, so that essentially capital could be deployed in a more efficient way. But it obviously went too far because the notion. I quote statistics in the book, which you'll presumably be well aware of. But the ratio in this country alone of managers' pay to average pay in their businesses has gone from about 25 times in the 80s to well over 100 times today. Are today's managers that much more brilliant than they were? No, of course not. It's just they're a lot more powerful because of the way that collective labor has been crushed. So again, one of the things I talk about in the book is, it doesn't have to be through traditional trade unions, but, there are lots of things you can do using new digital platforms. But the truth is that we have to find ways so that the voice of employees, of workers, is a collective voice, not an individual voice.
Yeah, and I suppose I can ask, where does Corbynism fit into that? Because to a certain extent, the politics of Jeremy Corbyn are offering solutions when it comes to trade unionism, are offering solutions when it comes to these problems of inequality. But those ones aren't the ones which you sort of touch on in the book.
Well, I do touch on them quite a lot. I mean, there's quite a lot in the book about all that stuff. But what you're saying is my policies aren't the same as Jeremy Corbyn's policies. No, they're not. I mean, that's partly because, apart from anything else, when one writes a book, one tries to say something a bit different from, what's just in the ether, as it were. I mean, one of the things, though, that I would agree with Corbyn and McDonnell about is we've been too scared in this country of, when I say we, I mean governments have in recent years been too scared of borrowing to invest in infrastructure, invest in knowledge, invest in research. One of the reasons why productivity is such an issue in this country is because there has not been enough investment of that sort, and it is something that we need to be bolder about. And there's also no, although we are more indebted, as a nation, if you add together household debt, government debt, and corporate debt, we're more indebted than we've ever been. Nonetheless, I've got no doubt that the government would be able to borrow at perfectly reasonable rates for productive investment. So that would be an area where I would agree with Corbyn. But I think the fundamental reason why Corbyn has done so well recently, particularly among young people, is because it's sort of hopeless for a Conservative Party to stand up and extol the virtues of capitalism if you have a nation of young people who wonder how on earth they're ever going to accumulate any capital. If it's impossible to buy a house because house prices are just so, have surged in price quite so much, if it's impossible to get secure employment, you inevitably in those circumstances are attracted towards somebody who's saying, well, the state can help. You're inevitably attracted to state solutions. Now, there are some of us of a certain generation who obviously have, personal experience of state solutions going wrong. But but it's also palpably obvious that over the last 15 to 20 years, the market solution has also gone very badly wrong. And what we need, therefore, is a much more imaginative mixed approach, plainly.
Yeah, I'm going to move on to, I suppose, a different area and talk a little bit about the media and how that is interacting with some of the trends which you've identified in the discussion, but also in the book. So there's a really interesting chapter about social media and its interaction with what you call the politics of emotion.
Yeah.
How radically do you think social media has changed the news environment, especially in the last sort of 10, 15 years where you've been right at the top of broadcast journalism in the UK?
So there's there's so much to say about all of this. I mean, if we just talk about the political aspects first, as it were, it seems to me that broadly social media is good, a fantastically good thing. And the reason I say that is because the thing and I think this was really demonstrated beyond doubt in the last election, is that the power of established media has been broken. One of the reasons why, I'm sure you noticed this, but, overwhelmingly, the established media was remorselessly, viciously negative about Labour. It was really quite extraordinary to watch, and yet actually didn't do and let's remember, Labour went into the general election at least 10 percentage points behind the Tories, probably more, right? And yet they end up neck and neck. Now, why is that? It's because particularly younger people were simply ignoring the newspapers, tabloid newspapers, and getting a lot of their news from social media, but it wasn't just younger people. And what's more, Labour had a very effective social media campaign. Some of it directed by the Labour Party, some of it much more organic. Momentum is obviously now very closely, intimately connected to the Labour Party, but it is a movement and it is separate. And the Momentum social media stuff was fantastically powerful in the general election. And one of the things that was really striking to me, one of the reasons why I, in the course of the general election, became convinced relatively quickly that Labour was going to do significantly better than people had been predicting and thought, was because, as somebody who spends far too much of my own life on social media, what I noticed was that the conversations that people were having on social media in relation to the election were about schools and about hospitals. And they weren't the stuff that was on the front page. So the front pages of the newspapers were all about, Jeremy Corbyn's alleged connections to the IRA and terrorists. Nobody on social media was talking about that at all. What they were talking about was, their fears about the abolition of free school meals for young children, or about the particular social care policy that the Tories had. And as I say, there was a total disconnect between what people on social media were talking about and what was therefore actually motivating people when it came to vote, and what the established media was saying. So that I would say is a profoundly good thing, because one of the things that has characterized, I've been interested in sort of politics and the economy and all of that for 30 years now. And one of the things that has always been less than edifying is the extent to which every party leader in my lifetime has been obsessed with getting Rupert Murdoch as a friend rather than enemy, obsessed with getting the Daily Mail as a supporter rather than an antagonist. I don't know whether you've seen it today, but there is a sort of hilarious but also rather tragic sort of narrative or sort of, this was evidence that Ken Clarke has given to the Competition and Markets Authority about the Sky bid, and he talks about and they were collecting evidence on, essentially whether or not Rupert Murdoch is a fit and proper owner of Sky. And he gave evidence to the Competition and Markets Authority about how when he was Justice Minister, Rebecca Brooks, who was then more or less running Rupert Murdoch's media interests in the UK, came to see him and sort of was broadly behaving as though she was running the government, and was broadly instructed him that because of conversations that she'd had before the election, this is before the 2010 election, with David Cameron, who Murdoch backed. Murdoch had consistently backed, Tony Blair, and then he switched in that election to Ken Clarke, or to David Cameron. Ken Clarke said that she basically instructed him that, because she was running a campaign on how we needed to build all these new prison ships because we didn't have enough prisons for all the people she wanted to see locked up, he was now going to have to build some prison ships. Now, fortunately, Ken Clarke, being a fairly robust individual, didn't take much notice of it, but nonetheless, he sees this as evidence of the extent to which broadly Murdoch felt that he was able to boss around the new government. And there is an underlying truth here, which is that broadly, media moguls like Murdoch have been fantastically powerful, but they are less powerful now. So that is the positive side of social media. The thing that worries me about social media is that there is an inequality of power here. So you get a billionaire like Robert Mercer, who some of you will have heard of, who is one of the founders of a hugely successful American hedge fund called Renaissance Technologies, probably the most successful hedge fund in the history of hedge funds. And it uses algorithms to essentially analyze market trends all over the world, and where it sees anomalies, it shoves its capital. And it's, as I say, its record over many years of beating the market has been astonishing. Now, he has put money into businesses that use algorithms essentially to do something similar when it comes to elections, to scrape data about all of our behavior on the internet and then target messages at us in a way that is likely to influence our votes. One of the reasons, now, there's no question that kind of data analytics works brilliantly on social media. One of the reasons, in my view, and I write quite a lot of this about this in the book, one of the reasons why Vote Leave did so well, one of the reasons they won, was because they were streets ahead of Remain when it came to using these sort of data analytics in their own social media campaign. Now, that is not a level. So what we have, therefore, is a very unlevel playing field for anybody who wants to use social media in a sophisticated way. Money massively talks in social media, not in a conventional way. It's not buying adverts, but it is about using technology, developing algorithms that effectively help you to target messages at vulnerable people. So one of the things that I do worry about is that our regulators are a million miles from understanding how unlevel this particular playing field is. And then you've got the added complication of a Russia, or indeed even, a country like North Korea, which are more sophisticated in a digital technological sense than we might patronizingly wish to believe. And there's the ability of Russia to hack the Democratic National Congress email system, but also to basically set up these troll farms and put out messages on social media that do influence vulnerable people and essentially to create mayhem. All of this is worrying. So you have this sort of weird paradox that you have social media, which in some senses, I think, reduces the power of traditional media that has maybe distorted our traditional, our democratic decision-making in the past, but now creates, other forms of slightly worrying uncertainties.
Perfect. Thank you very much for talking to me about both the book and that last segment there, moving into other areas. If it's okay now,
Yeah.
I'm going to take some questions from the floor, which I'm sure will be more erudite than mine. So hands up if anyone's interested. I'm going to take one from the front row here. So Can you wait for a microphone? It's just coming round behind you.
Thank you for your talk. Is it working?
Yeah, I think
Good. I'd like to ask you, do you think that to any extent the problems we're seeing in Western society at the moment are due to the collapse of the post-World War II consensus and a reversion to the much more unequal society that has historically existed before then?
No, there certainly is some of that going on. I mean, you know, we in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, there was a much greater sense of common purpose, of both solidarity between certain nations and within nations. And unfortunately, a lot of that has been dissipated. And it's been dissipated actually because, unfortunately, after an initial period of 30 to 40 years, you know, the common purpose was undermined by a particular form of individualism that I think was socially destructive.
Perfect. Do we have any other questions at all? We'll take one from the woman in beige there.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to go back to the sort of rural-urban country metropolis divide. So where I come from, Lincolnshire, it's a county totally devoid of motorways, of railway stations, and that's simply because the people don't want that intervention. So it's sort of, how do you make changes in these places? How do you unite the country if people don't want that necessarily?
So, one is constantly wrestling with this fundamental dilemma that, you know, within individual communities, you get resistance to a kind of change that, you know, you might think from the point of view of the country as a whole is destructive. And it is, you know, essentially, you know, we're constantly wrestling with, you know, what is the, you know, optimal size for sort of, in a sense, democratic decision making. I mean, I'm afraid there is no simple answer. And one of the things that is deeply troubling about, for example, the Brexit vote, is the huge divide between parts of the country which are set up in a way to not only adapt to change, but to, you know, genuinely sort of relish whether it's an influx of new people or new ideas. So university towns, for example, tend to be places which thrive on new ideas, new people. And it's not altogether surprising that university towns, you pointed to the statistic here, voted for Remain because they were impervious to one of the, you know, two strongest arguments in favour of Brexit, and one of them, you know, whether we like it or not, was a lot of people voted to leave the European Union because they wanted control over the people who come to this country. They voted for immigration control. Now, you know, in a place like London, in a place like Cambridge, where, you know, we thrive on an influx of people of all backgrounds and accents and ethnicities, you know, it seems mad to be frightened of that sort of change. But if you live in an area where you aren't used to that level of change, and you have what you think of as limited, and they for a period are limited, you know, whether it's medical or school resources, you know, when you suddenly get, and so there were some parts of East Anglia where you suddenly got an influx of, 10% of the you got from 0 people speaking Polish to 10% of the population speaking Polish. That feels threatening in a way that it's simply, in a place where I grew up, it doesn't feel threatening in the same way. So there is a huge challenge in persuading or actually changing the infrastructure. I mean, you can't, it's not irrational, if you've lived in a particular community in a particular way, particularly at a time of stagnating incomes, and you suddenly see a load of new people coming in, it's not mad to think this is impinging on my way of life. And, I was interviewed the other day, a particular interviewer was desperate for me to say that people who are worried about immigration are racist. And I can't, there are obviously some people who are racists who are worried about immigration, but actually large numbers of people who are worried about immigration are absolutely not racist. They're just, essentially living in communities where it is very, very difficult for them to adapt to change.
Do we have any more questions? I'm going to take one from the man in the tartan scarf. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about interviews. Charles has been very benevolent to you in his interview this evening, whereas at the last general election you made headlines, some might say for the wrong reasons, with your interview with Tim Farron. How do you reflect on that interview with hindsight, and what would you say are the most difficult interviews you've ever had?
The best interview, oh God, so on Tim Farron, so this was the interview, so you're probably going to have to remind me, so this was, I can't actually remember the precise question I asked him, but this was, as you remember, there was a furore over what Tim Farron's sort of attitudes are towards gay marriage and about gay sex. And he's a fundamentalist Christian. Do you actually remember what I asked him? Because actually I can't off the top of my head. I was not trying to be sort of sensationalist with him in any shape or form. I just think that it is completely reasonable to ask somebody who is leader of a party with the word liberal in its name, to justify religious attitudes that I think are illiberal. Now, I absolutely accept that everybody should have the opportunity to have their own sort of private faith and all the rest of it. The problem is that he is part of a proselytizing evangelical strand in Christianity, where it's quite difficult to believe that his private beliefs have nothing to do with, what he would do as a, somebody who potentially might lead the country. Now, actually, you might say that it was a slightly naive, the idea that Liberal Democrats at that particular juncture might lead the country is a slightly naive point of view. But nonetheless, I have to treat him as though, as though he would. So, I don't think that I, stepped over any kind of a particular line. These things are tricky. In some ways, I got more stick for so I was, during the election, I interviewed a chap who's no longer a member of the government called Michael Fallon. Well, one of Fallon's talents was, I mean, he has a remarkable capacity to sort of answer any question with a complete non sequitur. It's a very frustrating experience. And at the end of the program, I think I wasn't clear that the camera's still on. I actually sort of banged my head in frustration on the table, which became, I think the expression is a bit of a meme, as it were. The answer is, I don't think I was. I mean, maybe I'd have to go back and review it. I don't like being aggressive in interviews. Actually, it's not the way that I approach things. I don't think of myself as being soft, but I think that you have to, asking difficult questions is not the same thing as being aggressive. So I don't do, on the whole, I've very rarely done that sort of Paxman thing of asking the same question 42 times, because I sometimes think, that's more about the interviewer than the interviewee. I think the people like you sort of work out when somebody's not going to answer a question, and you make your own judgments. I mean, I, on the whole, take the view that people who go into politics are not corrupt, and they are doing a difficult job, and we should be sort of grateful that there are still some people who want to go into that world. I'm slightly depressed that actually I think the caliber of politician we have these days is not very high. And therefore, one of the things that I try to do in my interview on Peston on Sunday is actually to try and create space for people to actually explain what they're about. Obviously, I probe them when they don't answer questions and try and press them when they don't answer questions. But I do want to give these politicians the opportunity, even if they quite often fail to take it, to try and explain to all of us why they're doing what they're doing. Because apart from anything else, if people like me are putting off people from going into politics, that's a very, very bad thing.
Thank you. Any more questions at all? Perfect. I'll take one from the very back there. So can you just wait for a microphone to get round to you?
In light of the incoming technical or technological revolution that Philip Hammond kind of alluded to yesterday, what do you think the impact of automation and artificial intelligence will be on this country? Do you think it will create jobs, increase productivity, or do you think it will lead to mass unemployment?
So it is obviously one. I mean, I do talk quite a lot about this in the book. I mean, it is one of the big issues, and I think one of the things that is it would not be unique in periods of dramatic industrial change, although politicians often talk as though it would be. It's not unique for there to be really quite extended periods during industrial change where millions of people are worse off. So, and that's not impossible in terms of these technological changes that are going on at the moment. It's one of the reasons why I think it's very good that we're having this debate at the moment about universal basic income, because it seems to me completely plausible that we will need to be in that space. I mean, if you just look at the kind of shifts that we've seen as a result of just the wave so far of technological change. I mean, first of all, it's absolutely unquestionable that the kind of technological change we've seen has widened, again, inequalities, right? We are seeing particularly digital businesses becoming global leaders at a pace that we have simply never seen in the history of modern capitalism. So, it took the Fords a few decades to establish this extraordinary dynasty, and in the process they created hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of meaningful jobs for people. It took Facebook a few years to create an empire worth considerably more than Ford. The founders one founder in particular worth tens of billions, and the numbers of jobs created really quite small. And in the process, quite a lot of social and economic disruption across the world. True of Google, true of actually quite a lot of businesses that few that are not household names, but equally, set up very rapidly, and enormous fortunes accruing both to the initial backers and to the founders. It is very striking that despite these great technological changes, which in many senses have improved the quality of our lives, they are not increasing productivity in any significant way across the economy as a whole. And they're also, in the absence, as I say, of a collective voice for unions, they are also associated in many cases with a lot more job insecurity. So I think one has to be slightly anxious about these technological changes and what impact they will have on millions of people for some years to come. Lots of jobs that one thought of as being middle-class jobs are disappearing, whether it is some of the support services in law, in medicine. There are vast numbers of areas which are now being automated. And so I do think this is another reason why we have to accept that the role of the state is going to increase. I also think, given that this is just one aspect of the shifts, this is just one cause of these widening inequalities. I mean, again, we have to start thinking much more seriously about wealth taxes. If we want societies in which we have the sort of public services that unify us, we're going to have to pay for them. And if the greatest inequality at the moment is wealth, which I believe it is rather than income, then we're not going to be able to pay for those public services unless we are prepared to tax assets. Now, some people are asset rich and income poor, and so one of the things I talk about in the book is, you should have the ability to accrue your liability to a wealth tax as an IOU. So let's just say you happen to own a house that's worth an absolute fortune, but you've retired. My view is that you would be liable, let's say, to a tax of 2% a year, but you would only pay that tax either when you sell the house or, as part of your inheritance tax, that your heirs would pay as and when you die. But nonetheless, even if it's not being paid in cash, it is unbelievably valuable to a government, because a government can essentially borrow at a 0% interest rate, knowing that all this cash is going to come in. So I think there are these big, there are things that governments can do to mean that this economic transition is not as painful as it might be, but simply to say that we've got to be at the cutting edge of this industrial revolution, which is what the current government says. It's perfectly reasonable for us to be at the cutting edge of this industrial revolution. I'd like to see as many of these brilliant businesses being created here as possible. But you can have, even so, not everybody in this country will be the owner of a business that's, you've probably come across, the concept of a unicorn, which is a business that's worth I can't remember, is it $10 billion a unicorn? I can never remember whether a unicorn is a $10 billion or a $5 billion business. Anyway, the answer is, unfortunately, not everybody can be an owner of a $10 billion business. Some of them, quite a lot of people have to earn their living in a normal way. And the ability to do that is being undermined.
Perfect. I think we've got about 8 or so more minutes, so let's see how many questions we can get in that time. Can I take the person right here? Just wait for a microphone, if that's okay.
Hi. So in the light of, I suppose, these chronic divisions that you've talked about, and then I suppose the more acute issue of Brexit, which is sort of hurtling towards us, I haven't read your book, so I don't know what sort of remedies you offer up, but do you think that maybe a government of national unity could be an answer on what the chances of that happening are, and maybe who could be equipped to lead such a government?
So right now I see there's, the gap between, Labour and Tories is the widest it's been certainly since the 70s, so, or the sort of late 70s, early 80s. I think there's very little prospect of a government of national unity at the moment. although there's, arguably a case when you've got challenges of the scale that we face for trying to sort of in some sense forge a sort of collective purpose. I mean, we're still, I'm afraid, at that stage of, different sides grieving for different things that they feel they've lost, and there's way too much anger about the place for that to be possible. I fear that we're going to go through, until we get out of the European Union, a period where we don't really address the more important issues. I mean, one of the things I try and talk about in the book is how much more important these huge global shifts we just talked about, this industrial revolution that we are undergoing at the moment. We have this huge challenge to make the global economy work in a way that is fairer. These are much, I'm not saying Brexit is in any sense trivial. It's hugely important to this country. But if you assume, which I think is broadly right, that we've had a vote that won't be reversed. It could be reversed, but I don't think it will be. Then in a way, it's sort of slightly depressing that what we're doing at the moment is fixating on almost religious disputes about what kind of Brexit it needs to be, rather than putting together to get a sort of the most rational Brexit that we could for this country, while also thinking about, in my view, the rather more important challenges that we face. But because, particularly the Tory party is so unbelievably divided. I mean, they were divided about whether we should stay or leave the EU. They're now unbelievably divided about what kind of Brexit we should have. And because of that internal civil war, it makes it almost impossible to have a proper debate about, in my view, the rather more important things.
Perfect. I'm going to take two more questions, if that's okay. So I'll take one from over there, so when you're on the way back to your bench.
Thank you. You mentioned briefly how workers might organise outside the traditional trade union movement. I wonder what sort of form you think that would take, and whether it could ever match the power of the unions before Thatcher.
So you are seeing within different companies workers, for example, forming online platforms, using apps, for example, to share concerns, seek advice, organize together where they see a problem. And actually, I just think we will inevitably see more of that, and that's a very good thing. The other thing which I would like to see, though, is not just workers themselves organizing in that way. So there's quite an interesting app that Walmart workers have, for example, created. Walmart not being one of, on the whole, most progressive employers in global history. Nonetheless, their employees are now, in a sense, trying to fight back to an extent using technology. But the other thing which I think we need to see, my book talks about a sort of combination of both more nannying and less nannying. Now, the less nannying is, I just think we live in a world where, whether it's bankers, whether it's the kind of local officials that didn't take the right decisions in the shape of Grenfell, there's not in... We have a sort of system of accountability which means that people don't feel enough responsible for the decisions they take. I think if people would more, if the bankers that made crazy loans knew that they were going to be fined, imprisoned, or out of a job, they might not have done quite as many terrible things in the run-up to the banking crisis. So we do need, in a sense, more personal responsibility within our systems of governance, but we also need more nannying by the state in some way. So one of the things that I think is ridiculous is you have agencies that it's very easy to complain to if you've been, missold a financial product, or, your bank is behaving badly. But we don't have anything remotely like that if you are an employee who is not being paid the minimum wage, or is being asked to work outrageous hours. And I think that one of the things that you have to go to an industrial tribunal, and even though there was a very important court case recently which meant that legal aid is now available again to people to go to industrial tribunals, it's still a very cumbersome and off-putting way for most people to complain about their bosses. And so actually, I just think there ought to be the equivalent of something called, there's something called the Financial Conduct Authority, which is supposed to prevent, financial businesses from essentially misbehaving. There ought to be something equivalent, which, would stop the many, many businesses that, genuinely mistreat their staff.
Perfect. I think we have time for just one more question, so I'm going to take it from that person there just in front of me.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier about the investment and how very few governments within the UK have invested heavily in the future, sort of big investment projects.
Yeah.
And especially with the budget yesterday, it was a lot of like small sort of short-term solutions. Do you think that because of Brexit, whichever government's in power is going to be forced to face these long-term and create long-term sort of projects to move England past Brexit, well, UK past Brexit?
Well, I would hope so. But we ought to be doing that now. I mean, the reality is, so I don't know if you've ever read any of the work of an economist called Mariana Mazzucato. Have you come across her? So she's, I think, written very interestingly and powerfully about how successive governments all over the world have simply underestimated the good that governments can do in an industrial sense. Because the great thing about governments is governments can invest for the long term and they can take risks that the private sector never do. The World Wide Web is broadly only the result of government, money, particularly American defense spending money. Almost all the great medical breakthroughs start originally with academic research rather than, drug companies tend to develop work that that essentially public institutions initially do. And we massively underestimate the ability of governments to take the kind of risks that lead to genuine improvements in human welfare. The great thing, let's be clear, the private sector is brilliant at taking an idea that has already been effectively bottomed out in the public sector and then commercializing it. But there really aren't that many amazing breakthroughs that are done just by the private sector. And I think that is something we all need to slightly latch onto. There's a sort of, I grew up in an adult professional sense in a world where the public sector was effectively regarded as a sort of evil, a sort of necessary evil. But actually, there is no doubt in my mind that the basis of a good and thriving society is a public sector that does things that the private sector will never do. And it's not just about schools and hospitals. It's also about taking the kind of risks, particularly in a research funding sense, that ultimately lead to the kind of breakthroughs that improve our lives. And the other tragedy of all of this is, well, not only do we denigrate the work that the public sector does in this way, but also we make it very hard for the public sector to get the money back again. Broadly, the public sector normally gives this stuff away to the private sector, and that's where, and that again is hideously unfair.
Perfect. And very sadly, I think that just about that answer leaves us at the end of today's discussion. So in terms of stuff which is going on after this point, I think Robert's agreed to do a book signing run by Heifers just outside for the new book which we've just been talking about. And in terms of events which are going to be run by the union over the next couple of days, After this point, we have the main debate, the Thursday night debate on this house would kill one to save many. That's a philosophy debate. And we also have the former Prime Minister of Australia, Helen Clark, coming to speak to us on Saturday evening, and that's open. Did I say New Zealand? Yeah, Australia's. Yeah, sorry. We've also got, you've led me on to my second point. So the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, is coming to speak, and that's open to everyone on Saturday. And the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, is coming next Tuesday. So I'll make sure not to mix it up to the two of them. But those are the two events which we have on next week after this point.
And in your philosophical debate, do you name the one you want to kill?
Well, fortunately, I'm not debating, so I'd have to make that decision. But we'll have to see. It will be available on YouTube.
Anyway, thanks very much. I'm sorry I slightly waffled on today, but really nice to meet you all. And if any of you do have sort of follow-up questions, I'm very easy to get through robert.peston@itv.com. Nice to meet you all.
Perfect. And if we could all give a massive round of applause for Robert.